I'm really excited to introduce our next episode. In the last episode, we talked a lot about the importance of allyship, what it means, what it is, and more importantly, what it is not, and the importance of being asked for your input rather than just giving it. In this episode, we're going to talk, as I said in the last one, we're going to talk a little bit about the many contributions of Indigenous communities, but I am going to flip us back just a little bit because I feel like there's a couple of pieces on the allyship that I still wanted to explore. So Marlene, if you don't mind, I wanted to talk a little bit. Thank you so much for explaining, doing a great explanation of what allyship is, and again, more importantly, what it isn't. But I wanted to talk about the accountability piece. How can we be accountable? I think a little bit of it is understanding the harm that was caused in the first place sometimes and accepting it. And no one is saying that I did it or even my generation did it. And it isn't about blame, but it's about acknowledging. And so I wanted to talk about accountability and repairing some of the harm that some of the systems have done. So bringing us back to that, and then we'll move on to the other pieces.
Yeah, and accountability is a big concept in Indigenous ways of being. When we talk about self-determination, we talk about free will, that we're given free will on this earth. And part of the responsibility around that is being accountable for the choices we make. So it's a great topic, one that I strongly believe in, and it is foundational to the model that my agency works from. So what does accountability look like in allyship? Well, I guess to start with, it's about we haven't had the capacity in our communities and organizations to really address all of the issues that have come as a result of historic trauma policies like Indian residential school. And so we're still trying to build capacity to work with our own people. And so I think when you talk about accountability as an ally, one of the biggest pieces is around, have I helped build capacity in the Indigenous community or communities? What does that look like? That looks like saying, okay, here's this opportunity in our request for proposals to work with Indigenous people on this issue. Maybe instead of jumping into that, going to meet with folks in the Indigenous community and say, okay, is this one area that you believe should be taken on by the Indigenous community? And if it is, where should we lend our support, whether that's a letter of support or helping write a proposal or helping figure out a budget? There's still a lot of funding for Indigenous work with Indigenous people that doesn't go to Indigenous people. And the only thing that I know that works for our people is helping them heal in a cultural way. So start with that. How have I helped build capacity? I think the other thing is around if you decide that maybe your organization requires a change in practice because of the relationship that you have with Indigenous people that has led you to go and say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that we're actually causing harm with this policy or this practice. Share that information. How do we learn? We learn from our mistakes. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're so risk adverse around mistakes. And, we should be okay with talking about we made a mistake, but this is how we fixed it. Mm-hmm. And here's the outcome of that. So I think that those are some really good pieces around accountability. And again, it goes back to that relationship. And speaking with folks, getting to know folks in the Indigenous community to help understand the problems and challenges, but also then to have a look at yourself as an organization or as a human being and really have a good look at, are we doing the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? If I'm not, what should I be doing? And who am I going to go ask in the Indigenous community about this?
Yeah. And one thing that really resonated with me from the last episode is when you talked about how we in non-Indigenous organizations are just grabbing all the resources from Indigenous communities that we can, again, with those good intentions, but at the same time, maybe robbing some Indigenous people from these same opportunities. So I was thinking, would it be better to say, instead of always asking for an elder to come to me or asking for ceremony for me, would it be better to just say, hey, when there's an opportunity, when you're already running one, could we come to that? Is that a better way of doing it?
That's fair. I don't know if that's a better way.
Okay.
I think it's a different way.
Okay.
And I also think that, there are organizations that really want that deeper understanding. We'll bring on cultural people to help them with that. Again, if you're going to do that, look at who are we opening this up to in the Indigenous community. And this really struck me some years ago when we had a dignitary coming to look at what we were doing in a healing lodge. And so I had one of the men make some moccasins. And I had the moccasins, and I was going to package them up, and there were some guys standing around me that were living in the healing lodge. And one of them says, do you know that I've never owned a pair of moccasins? That hit me like a ton of bricks. And I swore to myself, I will never give a non-Indigenous person a pair of moccasins until all Indigenous people have.
Yeah, that's a great example.
But it really got me on this journey of access and how access to culture and ceremony and language was taken away. And what are we doing to bring it back? And my fear is if we don't address that, we're going to create cultural privilege amongst non-Indigenous people while our own people don't have access to those cultural practices or language that really will move the marker in our healing a long way.
That's a really powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to switch gears on us a little bit here. Excuse me. And talk a little bit more about the many contributions that Indigenous people have made to their country. I mean, sometimes we've got to be careful the way that we say that, because where have the contributions been made? We are living on Indigenous land. But I think sometimes we don't celebrate the richness that Indigenous people bring. So can you just talk to me from your perspective, what do you think are 2 or 3 things, or as many as you want, overlooked contributions that Indigenous people have made that we don't talk about, that we don't celebrate, that we don't teach in school?
Well, one that comes to mind, and one of the biggest ones, is the Great Law of Peace by the Iroquois. That has been the foundation of establishing democracies around the world. It was a democratic process that democracy hadn't been a thought anywhere in the world. But Indigenous people, the Iroquois, had established a democracy. And so foundational to democracies is that Iroquois law of peace. And if we think about that, it was a law of peace. There's a lot that we can learn from that, especially in light of everything that's going on in the world. So that's more from a macro perspective. From a very micro perspective, when we look at the city of Edmonton, some years ago I had an opportunity to sit at dinner with a group of Indigenous elders and elders from the Chinese community. And they were talking about the relationship between the Chinese community and Indigenous people when Edmonton was first established. And in those early days, Chinese people were brought to work on the railroads and suffered tremendously. At the same time, we had a number of First Nations reserves that were stolen from First Nations. The land was literally stolen right out from under them. And, we talk about Papa's Chase, the Michelle Band as examples. And so there were a lot of Indigenous people that were displaced. And so in that conversation that I listened to, the Chinese elders were talking about how Indigenous people would go fishing for sturgeon River, and then they would trade with the Chinese people for food because they were displaced and they were hungry. The Chinese people in turn would take that sturgeon and they would, and I think it was out of the bones, forgive me if I'm wrong, where they would create a glue that settlers in the Edmonton area used to build their homes. That's a tremendous contribution that Indigenous people indirectly have made to the establishment of Edmonton as a community. And people don't know that. And at the time, I heard our elders talk about how 97th Street used to be called Namao, sturgeon. And, there's a whole history around Edmonton and the contributions of Indigenous people to Edmonton that we're not really sharing in great detail. And after the TRC, there was a group of people who came together who did for several years the Amiskwachee History Series. And every month we would have different speakers at different libraries throughout the city come and talk about the history, the stories from Indigenous perspective. And we documented that. We filmed it, and it's up on YouTube still. But we need to be more about celebrating Indigenous contributions to our daily lives here in the city, this province. We know that Maslow's theory of hierarchy is a Blackfoot product. It was just taken and, Maslow took credit for it. That was a Blackfoot concept. And when we look, nationally, a lot of the crops that have been cultivated here in Canada were cultivated by Indigenous people, including corn, potatoes, and so on. So really, we need to celebrate our historic contributions. To make sure that we never lose sight of what that has been, or we know for the first time and we celebrate, but also B, to counter that narrative that our people were uncivilized and, we're just not capable of very high level thinking. Just because science in the Indigenous community looks different doesn't mean it's not science. Our ways of knowing are our science, right? So, it's really important to counter that narrative that we haven't contributed. We've contributed a lot to the world.
Without question, those are just a few really, really small examples. I'm just thinking, my mind already goes to all of our concern around the environment now. Indigenous people took such good care of Mother Earth, and it was non-Indigenous people who came along and changed that. And talk a little bit more about the love of Mother Earth, the understanding how everything nourishes us because of Mother Earth, and all things, animals, all of those things, and how important that is in the Indigenous beliefs.
We have kinship in Indigenous cultures. And, we often talk about Wakotuin in Cree culture. And that's that concept of kinship. And it's not just about our connection to each other as Indigenous people. It's also about understanding that we have a connection to the earth and everything that is on this earth that contributes to our ability to sustain ourselves. And so with that comes the understanding that we're no better than creation. That the blade of grass is just as significant as me as a human being. And understanding that means we respect. We respect every aspect of this earth. And when we talk about Wekotwin, it's also about the principles that guide those relationships: respect, kindness, love, truth, courage, and so on. And so really understanding that our connection that's our relatives. And when we talk about, our contributions and environmental sustainability or stewardship, we had practices that are only being recognized now. For example, I was always taught about there's a need for us to burn in the spring. Before the snow is completely gone, before everything dries up, you burn the dead grass, whatever. And there's a process to do it. You have to backburn. You have to go and burn where you want it to stop. Then you go to the opposite end and you let the fire go that way and it'll stop. And it became challenging for our people to do that because you need permits to burn and, without understanding, we're burning that field for a reason because it's going to bring to life all those seeds that are in the grass, all those, they're going to burst into life. That nitrogen that comes from the ash is going to contribute to that growth. But also we're protecting ourselves for future fires throughout the rest of the season. And I grew up that way, and I remember moving into my husband's community, and we had a fair amount of land, and I would backburn in the spring, and then I'd burn. And I remember being shouted at that I didn't have a permit, and never thought about having a permit. It's what we do to prevent fires later. So, that's a practice that now is being recognized when we look at, for example, the fire in Jasper, where all that deadfall was left, where there was never controlled burns, and look at the devastation. So there's a lot to learn from our Indigenous science. And I remember a few years ago being with elders who were part of a filming of Native Counselling Services of Alberta's Water the Sacred Relationship. And I was only involved with a group of elders from the community I was living in. But hearing them talk about how they observed what was going on in nature, and in doing that came to understand we got some environmental issues going on here. So, for example, hearing one elder talk about how, where there was a mine that was started in the area around 1970, and how 2 years after that mine and whatever production was happening there were no longer skunks and porcupines in the area.
Wow.
And how the elders knew, this is directly related to the industrial development that's happening here. And so there's a lot that we can learn about Indigenous science and Indigenous ways of being that can really help the world today. And it's not to take away from non-Indigenous science or ways of doing, but how can we blend the two? How can we work from both perspectives to make the world a better place? I know that one of the elders that I work with works with a Chinese doctor. And they tackle health issues from a traditional Indigenous medicine perspective, but also from a scientific perspective. And so this year I had the opportunity to experience that myself. Wow. I had a significant skin condition that had me down for a couple weeks. And the elder came to see me, and he brought me traditional medicine. He also brought me Chinese medicine. Sorry, not Chinese. Yeah, it was Chinese medicine. And they came in a pill form. And so, he was able to help me. I don't have that skin issue anymore. Wow. So there's a good example of how we can take that approach of taking the best of both worlds to make this world a better place.
Oh, that's awesome. The other thing you talked about earlier in terms of the contributions that struck me, especially in these turbulent times that we're going through in the world, is the incredible contribution to peace or peacekeeping that Indigenous people bring, thinking even about the significance of the peace pipe and how that means an agreement, or maybe thinking about grandfather teachings. And where I'm going with this is there's way more similarities. There's way more good things in Western culture and Indigenous culture that we don't always talk about. We think of them as very different, but they're not particularly different. So, just talk a little bit more about that.
I think you raise a really good issue around peacekeeping. Because we're all about relationships, that approach of how do we resolve differences? We resolve them by talking them out, but in a process that makes sure that everybody has the opportunity to speak. Western approaches to keeping the peace, I don't really know a lot about, so I can't really speak to that. But I think that in general, in society, we're a lot more comfortable with conflict than we are with peace. And that what we're seeing as this movement towards the far right is about differences. You're different, therefore you're not accepted in this movement. And I think if we can move past differences to what's our common ground. And it's something that has been a lifelong learning for me, to learn to be okay to sit with people who have very different opposing perspectives than I, so that I can understand them, they can understand me, and maybe we can figure out where our common ground is to start building from. And so there are ways we can work together on so many fronts. And I think we just have to be willing to be respectful and to say, well, maybe we don't know everything. We can learn something from you. There's things that we can learn from non-Indigenous people that we are learning, and vice versa. But just recognizing we have a lifetime of learning to do.
Yeah, it's excellent. So I just want to end this episode, just maybe, and I think you mostly touched on it, but I think we hear a lot about the concept of two-eyed seeing, from both an Indigenous perspective and a Western perspective. And I think you've talked a little bit about it, but just in a couple of words, how do you think we could better solve some of the problems we have today? We've touched on them, whether it's peace or unrest, or far right or far left, or any of those kinds of things, or environmental, those kinds of things. How do you think we could do better if we employed that concept of two-eyed seeing?
Well, I think we have to understand how the other people see things. That's the starting point. And often, as Indigenous people working in non-Indigenous systems, we have to walk between two worlds. And with understanding non-Indigenous perspective, understanding our cultural perspective, we also have to know when we have to draw on which side of that path. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we have to lean more into the non-Indigenous way of doing things to move through systems. Sometimes we have to lean more to our cultural way. But it's really in the context of whatever work we do, saying, okay, what's non-Indigenous approach to doing this work? What's the Indigenous way? When does which way work? Or can we blend both in a way that's more productive? But again, it takes relationship and a willingness to learn on both our parts.
Perfect. That is an excellent segue into ending this episode and moving to the next one, where we're going to move a little bit more towards what are we really talking about when we're talking about reconciliation, and what are we really talking about when we're talking about true systems change. So looking forward to the next episode.